In June of 2014, I started to become aware that there was another possibility for what happened to MH370. I didn't have firm evidence, but it seemed distinctly possible that the plane might have been victim of a Russian intelligence operation that had been carried out by extremely sophisticated and ruthless actors. And if that was the case, it would have two major implications. The first is that the plane would not be found on the southern seabed. And the other was that there was an actor out in the world that was highly dangerous, and that the world was in great danger, that this actor could cause great chaos and suffering. Fast forward to where we are today, both of those predictions have come to pass. The plane has not been found on the seabed, and Russia has carried out a wide-ranging hybrid warfare against the world's liberal democracies, including the United States. Most notably with the 2016 election of Donald Trump and the corruption of the political system that followed, ultimately the coup attempt of January 6th, 2021, which is an ongoing coup attempt. Donald Trump remains an active and dangerous political force. I'm recording this in September of 2024. We're less than 2 months away from his potential reelection, which I consider obviously a grave threat to democracy, not only in the United States, but in the world. With me today to discuss all this is Olga Lautman, who is a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, also runs an excellent podcast called The Kremlin Files. I highly recommend her as a source of information about Russia and its attack against democracy. We're going to be talking about how Russia has spread its attack against the West, its role in the election of Donald Trump, and what we can do, understanding all that, to protect ourselves for the future. Hi, everybody. Jeff Wise back with you. I'm very excited to host Olga for today's podcast. We had a long and very interesting conversation about a truly alarming topic. I hope that sense and reason prevail. I hope that her message can get out, that my message can get out, and that America does the right thing in the 2024 elections. We'll see. In the meantime, I would like to say, as I often do, if you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe, hit the like button, leave comments. There is a show page over at findingmh370.com. If you subscribe, you'll get a free weekly newsletter. If you become a paid member, you get exclusive early access to midweek content that drops every Tuesday. Right now, I'm putting out remastered episodes from the first season, Deep Dive MH370, where we go through each step of the mystery, describing what happened, the evidence that was gathered, and what it all means. We also have a chat going on the Substack show page where we're talking about our ongoing side project, which is looking at gathering drifter buoys, trying to collect Lepus barnacles that we can use to calibrate the Lepus that were found on the flaperon that was recovered at Reunion Island. This will allow us to have a much clearer understanding of how the flaperon traveled through the water and ultimately where it came from and what that means about the fate of the aircraft. It could really shed a clarifying light on what happened to the plane. And you know, this is a collective effort, and I'd really like to take the time to thank those of you who volunteered your time to help make this show and to help solve the mystery. In particular, I'd like to thank Keely for her unflagging energy and great ideas. I'd also like to thank Ben Cornelius, Rochelle Reynolds, and Aaron Murphy. Special thanks to new YouTube members, Carl Erickson, David Franklin, and Fran Sanfrisco. And to new show page subscribers, Sarah Yanag, Robert Orton, and Miko Numi. Your support means so much to me. All right, with that, let me now welcome today's guest, Olga Lautman. Olga Lautman, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a while since you and I talked. This is a topic that has fascinated both of us for a long time. Maybe fascinate is too positive a word. Concerned us, maybe. But you are a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. You also have a podcast yourself called The Kremlin Files, which I highly recommend. You have been a tireless and indefatigable and relentless, I would say, pursuer of the truth when it comes to Russia and its threats against the West.
Yeah, absolutely. Russia has kept all of us busy. I mean, for quite a while. I mean, now the West, more recently in recent years, has finally started focusing on how damaging Russian operations are. But I mean, in all honesty, they've been carrying them out for decades. I mean, we can even go back to the Soviet Union.
How maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background and how you got interested in this field.
So my background, my parents fled the Soviet Union. So I've always, paid attention to both Russia and Ukraine and the domestic affairs happening in both countries. I got particularly involved after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. That's pretty much when I started monitoring Russia and seeing, all the disinformation that they were putting out with the invasion and illegal annexation of Crimea, the illegal occupation of Donbass. And by then, after that, I was very involved in that effort and people knowing what was happening. And then after that, we had MH370, where Russia tried to put it on the U.S. Russia tried to put it on, how you call it, a Ukrainian shooting down the plane, where we saw in recent, I believe it was like a year or two ago, and the criminal cases that Russia was indeed behind the downing of MH17. And by 2015, while I was monitoring their disinformation and the propaganda and the Westerners that they were bringing to Ukraine for the illegal referendums in occupied territory, I started seeing a shift with U.S. elections and them taking interest. And I was like, what, scratched my head and I was like, what is going on? And basically spent the end of 2015 through 2016 and onwards looking to see why Russia was so invested in Trump, why they were pushing him. And basically, they were running the same playbook they had run in Ukraine during elections a few decades ago. And pretty much in all Eastern European countries, because Russia, has tried to destabilize Eastern European countries for decades since, frankly, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you had a lot of these countries trying to warn, the rest of Europe and US, and they were kind of basically pushed aside and told to, go sit at the kids' table. The adults are here. And now
Yeah.
you see they're the ones who had the first-hand knowledge and the first-hand, they were involved in direct attacks from Russia. And now they're the ones who finally, Western Europe and US, they're finally listening to them because they have, all the information, the tactics, how to combat these tactics and whatnot.
I mean, it's definitely an ongoing process. I mean, one of the things that has been struck me as so remarkable is the extent to which how hard it has been to raise the alarm. But I don't want to front load the show because that's sort of where I want to wind up at, is talking about why that is. I want in this podcast, we've had several episodes talking about hybrid warfare, talking about the world as Putin saw it. We had on your colleague at SEPA, Steve Harrell, who talked about his perspective from naval intelligence, military intelligence, looking at the threat of Russia. And I was, even though we have touched on it before in earlier episodes, I was hoping that you could just kind of sketch out real briefly what is hybrid warfare and why the Kremlin has used it as a technique so much in the last few years.
So basically, we would have to go back to the collapse of the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union collapsed, the hardliners inside of Russia never, forgave what happened. They couldn't deal with the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed, and they blamed U.S. and Europe for the collapse, and they vowed revenge. But after the collapse, they were busy with trying to stabilize the economy, and the security services were kind of in disarray for a few years, and then they needed to strengthen domestically inside. The security services needed to kind of resurrect because the KGB, after the collapse, fractured into two: the SVR, which is the Foreign Intelligence Service, and the FSB. And that's it. So basically, the 90s, we saw, Westerners coming into Russia, and because they are filled with resources, pouring in a lot of money into Russia. And this money basically was going to the mafia and to the security services. But then by the time that Putin came back, he was one of the hardliners, as many. I mean, this is just, the Russian mentality. They wanted revenge for the collapse. And we had nothing to do with the collapse. I mean, Russia was headed for that collapse because, frankly, the communist system did not work. Plus, the Soviet-Afghan war put a lot of strain on them. And also closing them off from, the rest of the world was difficult for Russia, the Soviet Union, to continue. And then after Putin took power, he spent the next few years stabilizing inside, putting his loyalists in various agencies, distributing state companies to his loyalists, and kind of making sure that everything's lined up inside so he has full loyalty. And then by 2007, you start seeing Russia now beginning its revenge. It started with Estonia. Russia, probably the first actually state-sponsored attack we've ever seen. They carried out an attack against Estonian government services and financial institutions. Plus, they used fragments of the hybrid warfare model and causing local protests. And this all started because Estonia wanted to move a Soviet statue off to outside of, the town, off to the cemetery where it belongs. So this is what enraged it. And you saw the disinformation and, these protests that they were trying to make violent on top of this state-sponsored cyber attack. By 2008, Russia invaded Georgia. And there was no response. And I have to go back a drop earlier because the key point where Russia saw that they can pretty much act with impunity was 2004, when they used polonium, a chemical weapon, on British soil to kill Litvinenko. Anyone else would have been held responsible for this, because here you are bringing a chemical weapon into another country to take out, Litvinenko, who was a former FSB officer, intelligence officer, cooperating at the time with security services in the UK. And there was no response to that. They continued their state-sanctioned, assassinations across Europe.
Well, again, can I interrupt you for a second? Because I do want to touch on something here, which is this idea that there's a kind of there are levels of plausible deniability that Russian forces tend to play with. We see time and time again, like using a super secret, like custom designed poison, in this case, plutonium, which is not something you can get at your, Duane Reade. And so killing somebody in a very sort of, in one way, sneaky way, but in a way that sort of signals who's doing it. I mean, sometimes I wonder if they do things in a way that makes it obvious what they're doing to the people who they want to know, but then make it hard for those people to make the case to the public. Oh, this is what's happening.
Absolutely. Because again, like you said, they could have easily, with Litvinenko, they could have shot him. And that's it, and bullets are available, guns are available. But instead, they decided to do a signature killing using a specific chemical that can be traced back to Russia, but at the same time, they can say we have nothing to do with it. Um,
Okay.
so absolutely, but it sends us, these signature killings send a message to other operatives who are thinking of defecting and cooperating with, Western security services.
Do you think there's a degree to which, as part of the hybrid model, which involves using non-kinetic ways of attacking your adversary, like, as you mentioned, cyber attacks, misinformation, disinformation, sometimes just like whacking people. Do you think that there's an element of this that sometimes involves testing the waters, testing your adversary's response, seeing what you can get away with, seeing how far you can push?
Absolutely, and they've done it in degrees. So they got away with the Litvinenko murder. They got away with the Estonia cyber attack. They got away with invading Georgia. Then comes 2014, they invade Ukraine and illegally annex Crimea and occupy parts of Donbass. Very minimum, backlash, sanctions on, that really weren't that effective. And that's it. And you see them, and then they were very heavily involved working with Iranian IRGC and Hezbollah in Syria, helping Assad, quell the protest, and in the midst massacring close to 750,000 Syrians, and then spinning disinformation on Assad's use of chemical weapons against his own citizens. So you see Russia is committing all these atrocities, and each time they are like, ramping them up. And as long as we didn't respond, they continue and continue and continue. Had we responded over a decade ago, especially with the Georgia invasion, then maybe not maybe, definitely we would not be here today. But basically, first Russia was sought to destabilize and, how you call it, and carry out these hybrid operations on countries that were under, as I call them, hostages of the Soviet Union. Ukraine was a testing ground for everything we're seeing, between the disinformation, between tampering in elections, and between, the little green men that they used to illegally annex Crimea. These were all security services from Russia and various GRU units and, how you call it, FSB units and mercenaries. But Russia, again, kept that plausible deniability to say, oh, we don't know who these men are with no insignia. And that's it. And then from there, they moved over to the West. Once they started, once they perfected this model of hybrid warfare in Ukraine, in the Baltics, in the Balkans, then they started shifting over to the rest of Europe and then to the United States.
I'm particularly interested in the events of 2014. I don't know if you would agree that that era coincided with the shift from mostly operations in the near abroad to kind of taking the fight to the enemy, as it were. I mean, do you think that's the case, that after the Maidan there was kind of a shift in Russia's operational focus?
I'm not so sure, because the invasion and illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, the plans were actually leaked in 2008. So Russia already had it in their sights, and somebody inside of Russia at the time leaked the basically all the towns that they wanted to capture, which then played out in 14. But then they just, in towns like Odessa, cities like Odessa and Kharkiv, they just weren't able to capture. But everything that happened in 2014 resembled the memo that leaked in 2008. So Russia was planning to take Ukraine for a long time. People say it's NATO, it's this, it's, and give all these excuses as to why Russia has done this. It's laughable that people are blaming Biden, and Trump runs around now saying that, under him, it was peaceful. there was a war raging since 2014. Parts of Ukraine are occupied by Russian forces and Russian government officials from Moscow and St. Petersburg since 2014. So I'm not sure what's peaceful and how he didn't see this. We know how, but I think this is something that they've had because don't forget their military operations are long term.
Mm.
It's not something, the only time it's reactionary is if they get invaded. But for the most part, Georgia was premeditated, Ukraine was premeditated, all their operations across Africa and Syria, across the Middle East. I mean, this is all premeditated. They planned for this, just like our Pentagon. Our Pentagon, unless America is directly attacked, we're not going to just step into, a conflict just like that. I mean,
Right.
if there is something, we plan for it. You have to, even for logistics purposes.
It's the big question is why? What is the objective in Russia investing so much time, resources in this attack against the West?
So, like I said, it stems from the collapse of the Soviet Union. They never got over it and they sought revenge. And their end goal is to overthrow democracy, to have democracies collapse, to show that democracy is a failed system. And this is why you see them propping up, a lot of the far right, in some cases, far left candidates and parties in order, and also the adjacent, like influencers and think tanks and everything with the far right and the far left in order to destabilize and basically collapse democracy. I mean, they want to see chaos. They want to see, US fall apart. They want to see Europe fall apart. They want to see countries, territory within countries secede, as we saw Russia's fingerprints in Texas exit and Cali exit, in Catalonia with Spain and Brexit. They want to see as much division, chaos, separation, alliances collapse, because the one thing that has held Russia in bay is NATO. Since, post World War II, we didn't see these kind of invasions of sovereign territory because there was, an alliance, a very strong alliance to make sure that every country was guaranteed its sovereignty. Um, Russia wants to break this. I mean, they want NATO broken, they want NATO to collapse, and that's it. And we see they suck on the military field. And I have said this. I mean, even prior to the full scale invasion, I said that Russia's not really militarily going to be able to accomplish much because of the corruption inside of Russia. They steal everything. Their, contracts for hypersonic missiles are sitting in yachts and offshore accounts because of the money stolen from these contracts. But a hybrid warfare is a good model because you are recruiting people from inside the countries to basically become the enemies within the countries and do everything to destabilize the countries from within. On top of the cyber attacks, on top of all the disinformation operations, it's frankly way cheaper than building a military force to confront all of Europe and the US. They wouldn't be able to.
I remember in 2014 watching these events unfold and thinking, well, this is rather scary because if Russia is behind some of these things, which it seemed that they were, then it means that we're kind of under attack by an adversary that is quite resourceful, quite sophisticated, quite determined, quite ruthless. And I thought this is very bad if we as a society are asleep to the danger, which I felt that at the time we were asleep. And I feel to a large extent we remain asleep. And one of the reasons I was so attracted to your voice on this matter was that you have been one of the most implacable enemies of Russian disinformation and hybrid warfare. And so it's been very comforting to have you out there relentlessly sounding the alarm. As you say, as 2014 turned to 2015, we had the emergence of this rather comical political candidate who no one took seriously. My wife was working for the Huffington Post, and they had a policy that they refused to cover Donald Trump in the political section. They would only cover him in the entertainment section because they didn't want this buffoonish character to darken the tenor, or make comical the tenor of their serious political coverage. How did Donald Trump get involved in Russia, and how did that play out?
So that goes back to the Soviet Union. Again, during the Soviet Union, we had a policy where we allowed Soviet Jews to come into the U.S. and Israel. During that time, Russia saw this as an opportunity, and of course, with everything, they flooded the West, particularly the United States, with a lot of criminals, mafia people, KGB agents, under the guise of escaping Russia because of, the anti-Semitism, because it was extremely difficult during the Soviet Union being Jewish inside of Russia. The anti-Semitism was through the roof. And I mean, during the 70s, it was peaking at very high levels. So the KGB saw it as a way that they accepted the Jackson-Varick Amendments and allowed Soviet Jews to exit the Soviet Union, to tamp down the tensions there. And with that, they sent a lot of thugs. Brighton Beach in Brooklyn became like home base for a lot of them. And they started coming in the 70s, late 70s, late 70s. Trump at the time with his father, they were real estate developers. And by the 80s, because he was so flashy and splashy all over the front news of, New York City papers, for all his scandals, and he was just a playboy and just like, sought every kind of media attention they can. He fell on their radar. And basically, being a real estate developer, you had a lot of these mafia figures who ended up in Brighton Beach in Brooklyn. And they, as I always say, with Russia, there's no separation between mafia and Russian intelligence services. They started flooding his properties with money.
So
And
sort
at
of
the
using him
same,
for money laundering, or what?
I guess money laundering, and I mean, they saw he was unethical. Like his first deal was with this guy David Bogut, and who you know gave him $6 million, I believe, or $5 million for 6 apartments, or $6 million for 5 apartments in Trump Tower. That was 1984. I mean, and at the time, did Trump question are you walking in with cash? No. So I mean, they saw between his personality that he was a narcissist. He sought this media attention. I mean, frankly, he's any intelligence agency's like dream target, because he's very easy to manipulate, because of all his insecurities that are present to this day. I mean, you see how even with Kamala Harris, how all she had to do was throw little bits into the debate, and he just couldn't help himself. He had to defend every single point, whether it's how much he received from his father to start his real estate development business, or whether it's his crowd size. He's just very easy to get. And I mean, I could just imagine the KGB at the time, like, oh, this guy, all you have to do is shove money his way, beautiful women, and basically work off of his narcissism, and say he's the smartest and the most brilliant real estate
He also
person.
seems pretty fond of money and not very scrupulous about how he gets it.
He couldn't care less how he gets the money. So that's how it happened. And at the time, by 1987, the Soviet ambassador took note of Trump and invited him to Moscow and St. Petersburg for Trump Tower deal, which was laughable during communism. But he went to the Soviet Union, and then by the time he came back from the Soviet Union after his trip, Trump was known to be very cheap. in New York. I mean, he, was wealthy. His wealth was growing in the 80s, but he was extremely cheap. But he spent money to place ads attacking our allies, which frankly could have been written by the KGB. And he placed these ads in three main, national newspapers, basically saying the U.S. should break the support for our allies, which is at the time the objective of the KGB, to weaken our alliances. And that's it. And then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you saw, basically Trump was heading into bankruptcy. They were heading into bankruptcy. But then eventually in the late 80s, you start seeing Russian operatives pop up again around him and start moving money, like, through his real estate and whatnot. He made another trip to Russia, this time in 96 or 97, and then continued going forward, so it is a good market. And the majority of his money came from the Russians. I mean, and the majority of his real estate properties are filled with Russians, whether it be Russian mafia figures or even Ukrainians who were tied to Yanukovych, who was a Russian puppet, and a former president of Ukraine who fled to Russia. And that's it. And so basically, you saw the majority of his money come from that. And, people at the beginning, I thought that maybe Russia had compromised. I'm sure they do. But then, the more that I looked into him and the more, like, over the years, just how shameless he is, I think he just prefers that system. He prefers that mafia style system where you are the head. You order, if someone's investigating, you order it to be disappeared, or the investigation ended. If your opposition, you just have them jailed. There are just people who love that system. And I think he is one of those who, like a mob boss, wants that type of system that Russia has in the United States, and is frankly jealous that, for instance, here the DOJ, continues to investigate him, rightfully so, for crimes that he's committed, and not enough. I mean, they didn't even touch the Russia stuff.
Well, it's remarkable the extent, Olga, to which he has brought his conception of United States civic life into the mainstream. This idea that people who devote themselves to military service are suckers, that if there's not something in it for you, you're a sucker. That the DOJ is the personal, enforcement arm of the president. That the president has absolute power. It's absolutely remarkable to which the conservative wing of American politics has completely bought into this sort of snitches get stitches view of public life, which is 180 degrees really from the traditional conservative view of like sacrifice and working for the greater good.
Well, unfortunately, the Republican Party got corrupted, as particularly with the rise of the Tea Party, and then, with Trump, he kind of, they used him as a weapon to carry out their the far right mega movement. They used him as a weapon to carry out their policies, because he's shameless and he'll do anything and everything. I don't know any other American who'll stand inside of a courtroom carrying on about the judge, and, without worrying about any repercussions. So they used him and he used them to kind of line them up as ducks and basically prop him up, because without each other, they wouldn't get their policies, because he's absolutely useless with policies. They have to basically feed, we need these justices put into the Supreme Court. We need to overthrow Roe versus Wade. We need to turn, this is how we're going to turn this into like, a military state where the military will be loyal only to you, not to the Constitution. We're going to turn Department of Justice into basically FSB, Russia's FSB, where it'll just target your opponents and critics and silence anyone speaking out against you. They need each other and they feed off of each other. Sure. And for the conservative movement, for them, it's, It's been not only the fact that they have power aligning with Trump, but they're being flushed with money
Mm.
from this. I mean, if you look at any one of them, from the propagandists and the podcasters to the politicians, if you look 10 years ago, they weren't, you know, they didn't
They
have
weren't a
this money.
force.
No, they weren't a force, and they didn't have this money flowing in because unfortunately, division, hate, and these radical ideas sell.
Yeah. I wanted to go, Olga, to 2015. I'd like to talk specifically a little bit about how Trump went from being an entertainment figure and somewhat, as I said, a clownish one, to someone who got set up with a real presidential campaign. And I'm particularly interested in the role of Paul Manafort and where he came from.
So Trump, first of all, this wasn't his first time attempting to run for president. After he came back from the Soviet Union, he at the time with Roger Stone, in 1988, set up a presidential like exploration committee to see if he would be viable as a candidate. And then he attempted in and out over the decades to try to get into politics to run for presidency. Interestingly enough, every time he came back from a trip from Russia, he seemed to always want to run for president. But then by 2015, Russia. So just to rewind the drop, in 2008, Russia, after Obama won and Russia saw there was a fraction of this country who basically despised the fact that we had our first black president, and they were burning effigies and putting out all these racist things against Obama. Russia took note of that, and immediately they started working on through this path and basically propping up all this division, because Russia seeks division and vulnerabilities in our society. And this was definitely a huge divisive point. So they started preparing for the 2016 elections, I'm convinced, in 2008. And they knew at the time, and as it got closer, that Hillary was going to run in 2016 as the Democratic nominee, because it only would be natural for her to try one more time. So I believe from 2008 to 2016, they started the preparation for the attack on the U.S. election. And a lot of it was putting out disinformation, on Hillary, on the Democratic Party, and kind of like over the years, little by little, poisoning the Democratic Party and causing this division and split between conservatives and liberals inside of U.S. And
But I
basically
mean,
by
Olga, to be fair, I mean, I agree with you, but they were not acting alone. I mean, they were, the classic kind of British Empire maneuver is you find the fault lines in a society and you stick your wedge in there. There was forces at work. I mean, the Russians didn't invent American racism,
no,
and they also didn't invent this kind of neoliberal attitude that, greed is good, which has become kind of the state official doctrine of the United States on both parties. But they saw an opportunity and they set about working on it. I mean, I think that's the thing that seems so incredible, is the idea that anyone would identify Donald Trump as a plausible subject for a presidential campaign.
well, again, they were laying the groundwork for it. And again, you're 100% correct. Russia doesn't create our issues. I mean, occasionally they'll manufacture a situation, but they work off of our existing divisions and existing vulnerabilities, and they capitalize off of that, exacerbate tensions off of what already exists. This is a KGB playbook, that just continues on. At the time, don't forget, Trump was a rising star with his Apprentice talk show. Mark Burnett was involved, with Russia and was supposed to do a puff piece on Putin around that time. So you had, and plus, Trump was known to the Russians. I mean, for decades, he's known to the Russians. Even if you look at Trump Tower, I mean, I would say 3/4 of his properties are filled with various Russian Kremlin linked officials, intelligence linked officials, and mafia. So, I mean, he was a very well known name, a household name for everyone. Everyone loved him from The Apprentice. And that's it. So he naturally, would have been a good person to push forward for 2015 and to prop up. And like I said, it wasn't his first time, thinking of a presidential run. This was probably his third attempt, if not fourth, since the 1980s of running for president. Once 2015 came, and he announced his run, interestingly, his associates from the Moscow Miss Universe, knew about him running before the American people did. And they had a meeting that May in Trump Tower in May 2015. And he announced in June 2015 that he was going to run. But they knew that he was going to run. And then eventually they were the ones who set up the meeting of the Trump Tower with Don Jr. and with Manafort and whatnot. So basically, they were preparing, to do everything to prop him up. And it wasn't just memes. This was a multifaceted attack on the U.S. election system. And then they put Paul Manafort. Now, Paul Manafort, honestly, that to me, the minute I saw him, I said, my goodness, we're in deep shit trouble. Because he was sent to Russia. He is, an agent of Russia for decades. I mean, he worked his main role was to destabilize Ukraine from within, since I believe he arrived there like 2003.
But so he was a kind of political operative who like was in the sort of he was an associate of Roger Stone's. And they were basically what we colloquially call rat fuckers, and they're basically just trying to come up with any kind of political tricks they can to get people in office, rather unscrupulous. But then he was hired by the Party of States, was it, in Ukraine, which is kind of a
Party of Regions.
Party of Regions, sorry.
So Paul Manafort and Roger Stone know each other since the Nixon era. They had a lobbying firm. Trump actually was their first client. They met him in 1980. So I remember when, the story was laughable that Paul Manafort, who lived a few floors underneath Trump, flew to, I believe, Tom Barrack to ask for a job for the Trump campaign. I'm like, why didn't he just take the elevator upstairs? He knows Trump for at that time, 30 plus years. So that story was laughable. But Manafort, both Roger Stone and Manafort worked in Ukraine. Manafort worked in Ukraine from 2003. He worked for the pro-Russian treasonous president Yanukovych, who in 2014 during Maidan fled to Russia and lives under the protection of Russia's security services. Manafort worked for him. And at the same time, he also worked and ran operations for Russia in Georgia, in Kyrgyzstan, against American interests. So, I mean, Ukraine was his main theater, but he ran operations for Russia in other countries, even when it came to, against the interest of America, like shutting down an American military base in Kyrgyzstan. And then he was, worked very closely in Ukraine with Russian intelligence services. Particularly his sidekick was Kilimnik, who was a GRU officer who worked for Yanukovych. And they basically did everything, one, to prop up Yanukovych, two, to solidify his power, three, to make sure he won the election, because he lost the 2004 election and ended up winning the election in 2010. To polish his image in the West, Manafort, allegedly had Western journalists, which now we see this tactic used to whitewash Russia's genocide in Ukraine, to basically write puff pieces on Yanukovych. So he, on top of his many tools, also recruited Western journalists to basically write the narratives that he needed to in Western press. And that's it. And then he basically used, because like I said, Ukraine was a testing ground for everything that we have seen against the West, including election interferences and cyber attacks and everything. He basically brought the same tactics to the 2016 election. And he still has been working from behind the scenes. I mean, 2020 election, Giuliani and co running around Ukraine with another GRU agent, Dirkach, looking for, Giuliani actually approached Russian intelligence, asking them to help fabricate information on Joe Biden and Hunter Biden during the 2020 election. So that was, I'm confident these were all Manafort's contacts. And Manafort obviously couldn't travel, so I'm confident Giuliani, at least either was acting on behalf of Manafort or Manafort connected him to these people.
So Paul Manafort, a veteran Russian agent, is in charge for a while of the Trump presidential campaign.
He was, and he played a crucial role in 15, but frankly, he did play a role, but like I said, the attack was so multifaceted that you needed all the pieces of the puzzle to come together. And that's where you had the Felix Saders and the Roger Stones and what was his name? The one... Carter Page. And frankly, if you look at, not only the Mueller report, but if you look at the Senate Intel report, which was bipartisan, you see over 120 connections between the Trump camp and Russia. So yes, Manafort was a crucial part in pulling everything together. But at the same time, Russia was coming every which way. And then you have WikiLeaks being used as a cutout, to distribute hacked emails that were fabricated. Some were because when Russia hacks you, they'll distribute parts of the truth and then inject falsehoods into that. And then you have, basically some truth and fabrication mixed in together. Same thing.
But this is very remarkable because you have a GRU unit hacking into the DNC servers, doing a phishing attack, which they fall for. These emails get stolen. They get kind of retailed out through WikiLeaks, which is a kind of a cutout operation. And then the press, the American press, buys into it wholeheartedly. And you get just a tidal wave of stories. And the remarkable thing is you talk about some of these emails have been fabricated. There was a news cycle for every, I believe that there was one of the emails was about a risotto recipe. There was really a no there. There was something about how Clinton's allies sort of suppressed Bernie Sanders's campaign. But we're not talking about anything like, we've gotten so inured to stories about stealing classified documents, taking foreign bribes, breaking the emoluments clause. It just goes on and on. And so the idea that this, she had been insufficiently, safe with her emails, and that James Comey had to announce that an investigation was open into her. All of these things took place as a result of Russian scheming, but with the full, I wouldn't say complacency, but the participation, I would say, of the mainstream press. How do you account for that?
Because I don't think, and we're seeing it today, I don't think that the Western media understands how Russia's information warfare operations work. And they are also used to, because with Western media, they're used to this both sidesism, that there's always, that you have to give weight to this argument and a counter argument. They don't understand that the weight they're giving is to the counter argument is to Russia's intelligence services. It's one thing if we're debating, health insurance or other policies. It's another thing when you're debating, something that was written in an email by Hillary versus, something that the Russian intelligence services did. And I mean, we see it now. Like, it's maddening because one, you see a lot of Western media outlets to this day whitewash Russia's genocide in Ukraine, call for negotiations. Why would you negotiate with Russia, who is illegally occupying Ukraine, murdering people, kidnapping children, reprogramming children, to erase their Ukrainian heritage and replace it with Russian, heritage, um, beheading people, and they're not on their land. It's a sovereign territory, and you have Western media outlets still, discussing negotiations instead of demanding that Russia leave Ukrainian territory. I mean, it's like if someone breaks into your house and rapes and kills your children and wife, and then someone comes along and says you need to negotiate which rooms you're going to give to this person. They're not, they're in your house illegally. They just committed the worst atrocities. Like, the goal should be to get them out of your house, not, how are we going to come to an end to this?
I think that most Americans agree with you. I think the general population supports Ukraine quite strongly, although some conservative politicians remain remarkably insensitive to that. I do want to go back to the narrative. Okay, so Trump, to everyone's shock and to considerable dismay in some quarters, including my own, Trump wins the election. James, there is already awareness in the intelligence community that Russia was involved and illegally involved in the outcome. James Comey announces that there's going to be an investigation. Donald Trump fires him. And these were somewhat more innocent times in U.S.
Not
politics.
only fires him, he invites the Russians, with allowing only TASS, which is historically known as cover for Russian agents. A lot of the KGB agents came in to U.S., under the cover of a journalist working for TASS, invites into the Oval Office and says, I fired this nut job, and now we can, we have nothing to worry about because the Russia investigation will be closed, telling the Russians this.
Right. So I won't get into the whole details about the Mueller probe and Bill Barr, but there's, let's say, I think you would probably agree, a lot of obstruction of justice going on that seems to have been memory hold from my perspective. I mean, it was pretty blatant, and yet it never gets talked about.
I think the problem is that we're in such an information age that everyone is being overwhelmed with just news and information.
Right.
And I remember that, I mean, I don't know how people forget this, but when Trump was in power, I mean, you start off with a 9 a.m. breaking story, which you're like, holy shit. By 10:30, there's another breaking story that made the holy shit breaking story look like nothing, and you're
Right.
moving on to the next story. And I think just between the overload of information, I don't think we're just able to process it. And then the fact that people get, a lot of their information from social media, from clips of news, from alternative news sites that, not mainstream media. I think that it's just too fast paced, and the media doesn't know how to deal with this fast pace, and they end up focusing on things that are irrelevant instead of the media doing their job and saying, what, uh, since 2016, frankly, I was screaming that Trump is an authoritarian and has these authoritarian tendencies, because he reminded me of Yanukovych, the one who got convicted of treason in Ukraine and fled to Russia. He has these tendencies, and the role of the media should have been to warn the American public of the danger of democracy. And unfortunately, people like me at the time sounded hyperbolic when we're saying this. and kind of looked like lunatics. And then
Yeah.
finally, by 2020, I think it took an insurrection and attempted overthrow of our election. For media to finally get to the point to say, oh, Trump, has dictatorial tendencies. I mean, this is
Olga,
a
I really
wasted
wanted to
four
talk to you
years.
extra. I wanted to talk to you extra much, if that's English, last week, because all of these, Trump, since he came to power, has been talking about no, sorry, Russia, 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 which he also refers to as the Russia hoax. And this is language that is echoed throughout the right wing part of the information ecosystem. And indeed, even in the mainstream ecosystem, that has become accepted that Russian involvement in getting Donald Trump into the White House is a hoax, is actually not true. And uh, and so I do feel that there is some progress in making people take seriously this idea that Russia is an active threat and that Trump is part of that active threat. Yet at the same time, I sometimes bang my head against the wall, as I'm sure you do too, at how this kind of narrative can persist.
No, absolutely. It is maddening. And the main mistake of American media, which I banged my head quite a few times back then, is as Russia was attacking us in 2015, 16, our election, and after, when there was an investigation, the media, I mean, in a very reckless way, and I think, again, this is just because they're not aware of how this operations work, they like kind of put it into two camps, like the Democrats claim and the Republicans claim.
Mm-hmm.
They politicized a foreign intelligence attack on our elections. And the thing which made me furious was that we were at that point, I believe, the 38th country that Russia attacked elections. And instead of broadening it out and saying that we are the victim of an attack by Russia on our elections, that they did this in France, in Germany, in Poland, in Estonia, in Lithuania. I mean, you can name all the countries, African countries, Middle Eastern countries. Instead of saying and discussing the broader context of how Russia attacks elections, how Russia recruits politicians and propagandists from within countries, how Russia props up extremes of parties and groups inside of countries to kind of squeeze out the center and to kind of collapse the center and cause chaos and so division within countries. They were like, oh, the Democrats said that the Russians attacked this. Well, the Republicans are saying that this attack didn't happen. Like, how do you discuss a foreign intelligence attack on our systems as a political thing? Like, Republicans and Democrats should not be even mentioned when discussing this, because it was
Yeah.
framed wrong from the beginning and just continued to go down partisan. By 2017, it was just like very partisan, that Republicans are claiming no attack happened.
Right.
Democrats are claiming an attack happened, and we know what happened. I mean, we had the agencies declassify information. We had the Mueller report, then the Senate Intel report. We know what happened, and it should have been addressed in that way.
Yeah. I mean, if it hadn't been for illegal Russian involvement in the election, I doubt that Trump would have been elected. If he himself hadn't committed his own crimes for which he was convicted recently, he probably wouldn't have been elected. Of course, we'll never know for sure. When we think about, well, to what extent did Russia install Trump essentially? To what extent did Russia steal the election in 2016? I mean, they didn't do it by themselves, as we've been talking about. They had a lot of help. They had a lot of help from a complacent media that always cast things in a very favorable light. And parenthetically, I just really want to say that there was a famous article by, I think it was Maggie Haberman, where she was talking about Trump's, desire to suppress the legal actions against him. And it kind of made it seem like it was rather justifiable that he felt that it looked bad that people thought that he had sought Russian help. And which my reaction was, well, it's not that it looked bad, that it seemed like he did it. It's that he actually did it. I mean, that's what he was, that's
And
what he was
people used to go
obstructing
to
justice
jail for
for.
this. People used to go to jail for this back in the day if you collaborated with a foreign intelligence agency for any reason. You went to jail, and apparently now you can just go on Twitter and openly collaborate with foreign intelligence agency, and it's like acceptable, and don't bother questioning anything because then it's an attack on the First Amendment rights and whatever other nonsense. And that's it. It's like it amazes me because during the Soviet Union, I mean, when the KGB recruited Americans, I mean, they did it in a very secretive manner. There were like protocols followed, and like you picture like Americans going to a certain location, turning the rock, making their little drop, and trying to keep their hands clean. Whereas now you can actually go on Twitter or any social media platform or on mainstream media and repeat Russia's intelligence
Yeah.
crafted talking points, and it's perfectly fine. I mean, nothing makes sense to
I mean, I
me.
was particularly amazed by how it turned out that Tim Pool, who was a guy, a podcaster who made all these videos talking about how Russiagate was a hoax, then it turns out he was being paid by Russia to say that and other things,
A
paid a lot
hundred
of money.
thousand, 100,000 per episode, 40 minutes
Crazy.
to scream that Ukraine is the enemy of the United States, and that we need to support Russia. This is what he was getting paid, 100,000. And now getting back to the broader context, Russians, I mean, they're sophisticated, but they're not that sophisticated. The reason I say this is because their playbook has never changed. What they did in the Soviet Union, the KGB playbook, it's identical to what they're doing now. The only difference is with technology advances, you can actually, reach more people. So instead of paying some operative in the US to place an ad in a local paper where maybe 50 people read it, and you're like, the KGB's like, yes, 50 people read our propaganda.
Yeah.
Now they can put it on and spread it to billions in a matter of seconds via various social media platforms. So Russia's not sophisticated because their tactics are as predictable. I can tell you pretty much everything they're going to do. I mean, and frankly, 9 out of 10 times I'm right because they keep repeating the same thing. The problem why Russia is successful is the enablers. Without the enablers in the West, without the journalists, and not all journalists, but there are journalists that have been found to be on Russia's payroll, without the propagandists, without the politicians, without people like the NRA. And that's why I say Russia for 2016 was laying the groundwork to attack our elections. There is no coincidence that they invited members of NRA to Russia, who ended up being used as a money funneling, operation for the Russians during the 2016 election. No coincidence that they invited evangelical leaders to Russia during the 2010s, which ended up being a key component of the 2016 election. So the reason they're successful is because they are using people from inside the country.
Okay.
This DOJ indictment that recently came out, which was a few decades too late, showed what Russia has been doing, how they are hiring people inside the US, inside European countries, to basically betray their country, to push Russian narratives against us in order to destabilize us, our democracy, to sow division and chaos. And frankly, we've seen over the past, I would say, several years, that Russia is not only indoctrinating people online, they're also pushing these people to go offline and commit violence. And you've
Mm.
seen this with the Yellow Vest protest in France. You've seen this here with various protests. You've seen this, in Canada. So Russia's tactics are kind of shifting, where now they don't want the division only online. They actually want you, burning a mask in front of a school. They want you fighting with your fellow Americans, over the Second Amendment or over pro-life versus, what is it, pro-life versus
Pro-choice,
pro-choice.
pro-life. Yeah.
Pro-life versus pro-choice, and things that normally we have our own divisions on. They want to exacerbate these divisions to the point that we're like either beating each other up or just not speaking with each other, because the more we get divided, the weaker we become, and the more easy prey we become for our adversaries, whether it's Russia, Iran, China, North Korea, or frankly anyone at this point, who is looking to take us down.
There's a perspective amongst serious people who I respect and consider generally smart, but there's this idea that the question of whether Trump is a Russian agent is missing the point, that there are systemic issues that have been developing for decades, if not centuries, and that all of these things that you've been talking about are the result of forces that are much larger than any one person and any one single intelligence operation. But I do want to ask you, do you think it's accurate to say that Donald Trump is a Russian agent?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, since the 1980s, Trump has been, pushing Russian propaganda. There was a very big tell in the 1980s, a particular point where Trump was obsessed with Gorbachev. I mean, beyond obsessed with Gorbachev, to the point that he was excited that there was a Gorbachev, that Gorbachev was going to come to Trump Tower. I believe it was an actor that played Gorbachev. But then when the KGB turned on Gorbachev and were preparing a coup, suddenly Trump, out of nowhere, imagine an American real estate developer who's like on the headlines, running around sleeping with people in New York, suddenly comes out and says, oh, Gorbachev is so weak. He's a weak man, and attacking him. I mean, it sounded absurd, but it was in line with exactly what the KGB was preparing, a coup against Trump. So he,
You mean a coup against Gorbachev?
A coup against Gorbachev. So he has always aligned himself with that system. He enjoys the system. He wants that power because the Russian system is very mafia-like. It's a security state system where you have people at the top who can order the end of investigations, who can order investigations to be open, who can jail their opponents, kill their opponents overseas, domestically, and do whatever they basically want. And Trump enjoys this power. So I think, he's been entangled with them for so many decades that he, knowingly is pushing their propaganda, whether it was for the 2016 election, whether it's with Russia's, attack on Ukraine, the full-scale invasion, or whatever that Russia is pushing, you always see it come out of Trump. Helsinki, I'll never forget. My blood boiled. I sat there. I was like, I cannot believe this is an American president.
At Helsinki?
So Trump basically stood next to a KGB war criminal thug, siding with Russia's intelligence agencies against our agencies, saying that Russia did not attack our elections and that Putin said so, and that their basically intelligence services didn't find any, meaning to this. So he stood on a global stage siding with a KGB war criminal thug against the men and women who risk their lives to make sure that America is protected. And the fact that he did everything you see. I mean, it has been Russia's dream to attack our military, but not physically attack it. They can't. They'd be destroyed in 48 hours. But to kind of weaken the image of our military. What did Trump do? Straight for attacking our military. They're suckers and losers. They're this, and he constantly demeaned the military. He did everything to split the military, versus people who were loyal to him against people who were loyal to the Constitution. The media. Russia has always wanted to destroy this notion of a free press what did Trump from day one do? The media is the enemy of the people. Granted, I have a lot of criticism for our media, but they're not the enemy of the people. They are part and a very crucial part of a functioning democracy. So basically, every single thing that they did, that Russia said, Trump repeated. Furthermore, I've been monitoring Russia forever. This was the first U.S. president where Russia released all the phone calls that I learned about Russia having a phone call with Trump from the Russian side. They released the transcripts of the phone calls first. They released the meetings of any like upcoming meetings with Trump first. It never happened before. This never, it would
Mm.
not with any Republican or Democratic president has it ever happened that, two presidents of a state have a phone call and that the Russians release it before the United States. Under Bush, it didn't happen. Under Obama, it didn't happen. Clinton, no one. And this was the first time that I would find out about these key phone calls, what was discussed, according to the Russians. We don't know what was discussed, but according to the Russians, from the Russian side.
Now, it's not illegal to be a fan of any particular country or political system. That's everyone's First Amendment right. However, I think that it's worth clarifying this question of did he get something in return, which I think is what really makes someone a foreign agent rather than just a friend. And there was a lot of rhetorical energy put into back in 2016 drawing a line between, arguing about the meaning of collusion. And the idea was sort of put out there that just sort of coincidentally, unasked, Russia was putting its thumb on the scale, but that there was no coordination. There was this famous meeting at Trump Tower, but nothing came of it. There was a lot of plausible deniability that always seemed to me a little implausible nonetheless.
I mean, if your aim is to murder someone and you miss, but take the shot and didn't murder them, you still will be tried criminally for a crime because of the premeditation. In the Trump Tower meeting, they literally sat with Russian agents who were offering dirt on Hillary Clinton. Last time I checked, you are not allowed to go to a foreign intelligence service to even if you didn't get the dirt. You're not supposed to go to a foreign intelligence service and discuss even obtaining this dirt or what you might have and whatnot. Nonetheless, responding, wonderful, send us what you have, as Don Jr. did. Kushner, according to reports, went to the Russian ambassador to U.S. and asked if he can set up a back channel through the Russian embassy to avoid CIA detection or FBI detection. Last time I checked, you're not allowed to go into, to your adversary or frankly anyone. I don't think you're even allowed to do it if it's British and there are friends. You're not supposed to go to the Brits and say, hey, listen, let's set up a back channel through your embassy because I don't want our agencies to know what's happening.
But if Trump had a relationship with the Russians for decades, why did he even need to set up a new back channel? Didn't he have extensive connections already? Wasn't Paul Manafort on the payroll of the Russians?
I mean, the Russians, you see, they always set up 17 routes for one thing. I mean, it's just how they operate. And at the time, during the meeting with Kislyak, Kushner and Flynn, met with Kislyak. Kushner had the genius idea of setting up, a back channel through the Russian embassy so they could have these communications. Flynn proposed having a meeting, in a third party country to avoid detection of security services. And not even a month later, there was a meeting between the Russians. I believe it was Eric Prince and Eric Prince on behalf of Trump. In Seychelles. So I mean, this offshore third country meeting did happen. So that's why, last time I checked, you're not allowed to do these things. I don't know, Russia's excellent with finding the threshold of criminality, but I think we have plenty of cases where there were, the criminal threshold was reached, you know. But Russia's best intelligence operations are to stay right underneath the threshold of criminality in order
Right.
to be successful.
So, as I was saying before, in 2014, I started to grow worried that Russia had very sophisticated capabilities and that they were absolutely ruthless in using them. I worried what this meant for the world, frankly, and for my own country. And that was March of 2014. And then come January of 2021, I came back from a run and my wife was watching television. She was like, I can't believe this. And there were people swarming over the Capitol building. There was an attempt by Donald Trump to overthrow the constitutional system of democracy and claim power for an unelected second term. That attempt is ongoing. He's still trying. It's sort of a slow motion coup. He has considerable public support. In fact, it seems to be the general consensus is that he's got a 50-50 shot. I'm talking to you now in September of 2024. So we're about less than 2 months out. And he might do it. He might actually succeed. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, because I think that the only exit hatch from this nightmare is to somehow shake people out of their complacency. I think it's happening, but I don't know if it's happening enough.
No, it's extreme. First of all, I don't understand the American election system of how a convicted felon can run for president, where he wouldn't pass a background check to work in a department store. So
Well, it's
that's me.
explicitly constitutionally forbidden, and yet he has stacked the level of corruption that has come in the door with Donald Trump is absolutely breathtaking.
Yeah.
He has installed amongst other things, a judge in Florida who threw out his case on absolutely laughable grounds because
Yeah.
the system is corrupt and there are individuals who are deeply corrupt. Anyway.
Yeah, no, 100%. But Trump started his attack in 2016 on our election because he started, back then, that if he loses the election is rigged, that they stole the election. And he was testing out basically what happened in 2020 and 2016. No other candidate has ever said, if I lose this election, then it's rigged. Hillary stole it. This one stole it. And, the deep state did it. They're all trying to stop me. And frankly, all the other garbage that flew out of his mouth. So he started laying the groundwork on attacking our democratic system and processes in 2016, continue to a physical assault on, the Capitol, which was frankly the most devastating and infuriating thing to see after indoctrinating his supporters for, 4 years of basically painting liberals as enemies that need to be destroyed by all means, including a civil war, and that we are a threat to the country. And it's like crazy because no other American president has ever tried to divide people in such a way. And frankly, before 2015, I don't think most people will even discuss politics with their friends or family. And since then, there have been so many friendships and family members who just have stopped speaking. Friendships have been broken, because of how people dug into each side. Prior to that, it was like one of those things, you don't ask what team you're rooting for. You don't ask who you're voting for unless you have that type of relationship. And he continues to do it now. He's again, continuing that if the election is stolen, if he loses, the election is stolen. And he's doing, frankly, everything to attack our democratic institutions and processes, and elections and voting is the number one, thing in a democracy. I mean, this is what democracy is: people voting to put other people in power. And once you start, delegitimizing it, you grow and have this. Now, do I think that he has a 50% base? No. I think that there are probably maybe 20-25% in America who honestly do believe 2016 was stolen and whatnot. I think others in the Republican Party, I think he has like a 47% ceiling, just go along with him because they like his economic policies or whatever the case is. They don't want to vote Democrat. But his hardcore supporters, I do think, is like 25% of, U.S. who actually believe this. And this is dangerous to have, even a quarter of our population actually believing that our democratic systems don't work, that there's a deep state. I mean, the whole concept of deep state is laughable. If the deep state wanted Trump out, they'd take him out a long time ago. I mean, we have the most competent people working for different agencies, and if they wanted him out, they'd take him out. There is no deep
Yeah.
state. There's just regular civil servants who come to work and work, whether Department of Justice or Treasury or whatever it is, they work and do their work. But he, like Russia, and again, deep state goes back to the Soviet Union, because the Russians used to peddle that then with this imaginary deep state inside of US. There is no deep state, and he uses this to kind of, again, destabilize our institutions. So anything coming out of the Justice Department, his loyal supporters won't believe it. Any news coming out of court systems, unless it's favorable to him, his supporters won't believe it. And he has managed to delegitimize every institution for his hardcore supporters. But
Yeah, I
I
mean,
think
if
we will prevail. I'm
you think
honestly
we'll
up to.
prevail, I hope so. I find it unbearable to think about the alternative.
Oh,
For all of the reasons you just cited, if he wins in this coming election, we are in really deep doo-doo. We are in for some very dark and protracted dark times. But I do want to ask you, if Kamala Harris does win and democracy does endure for a little longer, what should we do? What can we do? What can we as the people do? What can I do as Jeff Wise? What can you do as Olga Lautman? How can
I
we
think
try to dig ourselves out in a sort of lasting way, if that's
I think
possible?
for starters, if we took the foreign influence out of our country, I think that be very helpful. I personally think we need to continue at this point pressuring the Department of Justice release and indict everyone who needs to be and release all the information, because the only way to fight what Russia is doing, Iran is doing, China is doing, North Korea is doing, and everyone else who's attacking us is to show these enablers, to basically expose them, to show the tactics, to show how the money was moved from, account A to account B, from this country to that country to this, to show like all the evidence. And if you look at the DOJ indictment, I mean, granted, most of us knew that these people are sitting on Russia's payroll, because of no normal American would sit morning to night spouting garbage about Ukraine for free, you know. So we knew, but this indictment sent shockwaves, because not only did it, show the methods and the tactics and the people involved, it showed, now you see what they're saying. And I mean, now every regular American who maybe wasn't savvy to Russia's operations knows that these people were paid by Russia to say, push narratives that are crafted by Russia. And I think
Yeah.
transparency is key. And we need to have more indictments. And that indictment, which was amazing, it was like a talking indictment that basically laid out a case. It said there were, I believe, 800 more of these propagandists on Russia's payroll in the U.S., and I believe 2,800 that the FBI is watching. We need to have a list of these 800, and we need to see, more and more and more of these indictments come in, because each time you bring an indictment like this, you're disrupting a Russian intelligence operation. In this case, you disrupted RT and, this route, and you put others on high alert, because they start scrambling in order not to, get caught up. and which reveals even more information. So I think that's what we need to push. We need to push our government to finally tackle Russia's influence operations, their malign influence operations, their money flowing through, our political system. And not only Russia, again, I focus on Russia, but I mean, Iran is harmful. We should not have anyone paying a politician to put that to buy a seat for them. Like, they are the ones, they're supposed to be representing the constituents, not representing the interest of foreign governments. And frankly, I was more than happy to see when Menendez was found guilty, because you have a New Jersey senator who has gold bars coming money from Egypt. Why are you, as a New Jersey senator, representing Egyptian interest when you have
No,
a?
it's remarkable. The corruption is widespread,
It needs
but
to be
it's
cleaned
not a
out.
conspiracy, huh?
It needs to be cleaned out. This
It needs
corruption,
to be
like,
cleaned out. It
yeah.
needs to be cleaned out. We really need to clean house. Olga, I want to thank you so much. I've been wanting to get you on for a long time, and I'm grateful for you being so generous with your time and your expertise. I recommend everyone to check out her podcast, The Kremlin Files. Follow her on Twitter as well, because she is an endless fount of information, and I think a helpful source of outrage, because it is truly insane how things have been allowed to develop, and I hope we can reverse course in that regard. Olga, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, I'm so happy that Olga came on the show. She is someone I've respected and admired and listened to carefully for years now. She has been tireless, and she's been accurate in portraying the role that Russian intelligence operatives have in really corrupting the US system and corrupting the system of democracy all around the world. As I said at the top of the show, we are now, as I'm recording this, on the verge of potentially the Russian support of Donald Trump bearing its ultimate fruition, which is a takeover of the political system in the United States. Let me not mince words. If Donald Trump is reelected in 2024, he will end democracy. There will be no more constitutional democracy in the United States. We will enter a very dark time. I don't know how we will get out of it. I presume that we will get out of it eventually, but that will be a historical matter. And I would much prefer not to see that. One of the reasons I have written so passionately, so determinedly about MH370 over these years, and written a book and written many articles and done this podcast and appeared in documentaries, is I do feel that beyond the scope of air crash investigation and how this and what the fate of this plane was, that realization in June 2014 has driven me ever since that time, which is that if I can help people to understand what happened to this plane and all of the things that followed as a result of those actors, we might have some hope of mitigating its worst effects. I have failed in that regard. I've had a very hard time helping people to understand what happened to this plane. I've had a very hard time. I and people like Olga Lautman have had a very hard time really getting people to grasp the gravity of what Russian involvement in the corruption of the American political system has wrought. So a lot of people will say, oh, Jeff Wise, you suffer from Trump derangement syndrome. Well, you can judge for yourself and weigh the evidence. Don't just, think, well, it's never happened before. It seems so unlikely. It sounds like a conspiracy theory. Truth is stranger than fiction. We live in very dangerous times. Things are happening that people have not been prepared for it. Least of all the press. I think the press has a very hard time getting their head around the true nature of the threat that we face. So on that somewhat dark note, but also maybe optimistic, because I do hope that if you are listening to me now, if you are understanding what I'm saying now, perhaps you too will be part of the solution, helping us break out of this nightmare, help us break democracy free from the threats that are assailing it, and return our democracy to a safe place, or at least a safer place. It's a nature of democracy to be contentious. We'll always have our arguments and disagreements, but we can do so in a place of mutual respect and peace. I hope for peace. Okay, with that, I have reached that moment that I always do with each episode where I will tell you, don't stop looking and don't stop asking hard questions. Thanks for joining me today. See you next time.